The morning of August 6, 1945, began like countless others in the underground command center beneath Tokyo. At precisely 8:15, a single encrypted message arrived from the Western Military District that would shatter every assumption Japan's military leadership had maintained throughout 3 years of devastating warfare. The revelation contained in those brief lines would force them to confront a reality they had systematically denied since the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. The Americans hadn't been fighting with their full strength. They had been holding something back, something unimaginable. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, the fortified command center stretched through reinforced tunnels carved 90 feet into solid rock. The walls, lined with 4 feet of steel-reinforced concrete, had been designed to withstand the heaviest conventional bombardment. Inside this fortress, Japan's highest military commanders had spent months managing what they privately acknowledged as a deteriorating situation, though publicly they maintained an unwavering facade of eventual victory through superior spiritual determination. Field Marshal Shinro Kohata had just begun reviewing the morning intelligence reports when Communications Officer Lieutenant Colonel Teisher Yamamoto burst through the heavy steel doors. The young officer's face was ashen, his usual military bearing abandoned in his urgency. The message he carried, decoded just moments before, consisted of only a few fragmented sentences transmitted from the Western Regional Military Headquarters before all communication ceased entirely. Complete urban destruction achieved by single explosive device. Blast radius exceeds all known bombardment parameters. Weapon type unknown. Casualties beyond calculation. Requesting immediate, the transmission had ended mid-sentence, as if the operator himself had been swept away by whatever force had consumed the city. General Yoshiro Yumizu, serving as chief of the Imperial General Staff, read through the message multiple times, searching for some error in translation or transmission. His initial assumption, shared by others in the room, was that the Americans had orchestrated their largest conventional bombing raid yet, perhaps 500 or more B-29 superfortresses dropping incendiaries in perfect coordination. The alternative seemed mathematically impossible. The target city housed over 350,000 souls spread across 27 square miles of urban landscape. No single weapon could eliminate such a vast area. But as the morning progressed, additional reports filtered in that challenged even their most pessimistic calculations. Weather reconnaissance units had logged only 3 American bombers over the target area that morning. Not 300. Not 30. 3 aircraft total. Admiral Suemu Toyota, who commanded the Naval General Staff, stood transfixed before the massive strategic map that dominated the war room's eastern wall. His intelligence teams had become remarkably proficient at tracking and predicting American air operations. They understood bomber formations, typical payload configurations, and expected damage patterns from 3 years of increasingly devastating raids. Nothing in their extensive experience suggested 3 aircraft could obliterate an entire metropolitan area. By 10 o'clock, reconnaissance pilots attempting to approach the destroyed city reported phenomena that defied conventional military understanding. They described a towering cloud formation rising over 40,000 feet into the stratosphere, visible from a distance of 150 miles. The cloud itself seemed alive with unnatural colors, violent purples and burning oranges that pulsed with their own internal illumination, as if the very air had been transformed into something alien and hostile. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo received the first coherent eyewitness account just before noon from a railway administrator who had been stationed 15 miles outside the blast zone. The man's testimony, carefully transcribed by Togo's personal secretary, described an initial flash of such intensity that it seemed to rival the sun itself, followed seconds later by a pressure wave of unimaginable force that had derailed entire trains and flattened buildings miles from the city center. He reported that where the city's heart had once beaten with life and commerce, there now existed only a hellscape of fire and devastation visible from the surrounding mountains. The Supreme War Council convened for an emergency session at 2 o'clock that afternoon in an atmosphere of unprecedented tension. Prime Minister Kaneko Suzuki, who had already survived multiple assassination attempts merely for suggesting the possibility of negotiated peace, read through the accumulated intelligence reports with trembling hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of terrible understanding. "Gentlemen, we must carefully consider what this development means for our nation's future." General Karachika Anami, serving as Minister of War and remaining the most vocal advocate for continued resistance, immediately dismissed the reports as American psychological warfare. "This is propaganda, nothing more. They want us to believe they possess capabilities beyond reality. The city was destroyed by conventional bombing, and they're using deception to magnify the impact. Admiral Toyota interrupted, a breach of protocol that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. 3 aircraft enemy san. Our radar systems tracked them. Our observers confirmed it. 3 planes accomplished what should have required hundreds. The silence that followed was suffocating as the full implications of this reality settled over the assembled leadership like radioactive ash. For 3 years, every aspect of Japanese military doctrine had been constructed on a foundational premise: that American industrial superiority could be neutralized through Japanese tactical brilliance, spiritual strength, and willingness to accept casualties that would eventually break American political will. This calculation had informed every strategic decision since the war's inception. When American factories produced 300,000 aircraft, Japanese commanders consoled themselves that their pilots, though vastly outnumbered, would fight with 10 times the determination. When American shipyards launched vessels faster than German submarines could sink them, Japanese strategists insisted that American sailors lacked the warrior spirit necessary for ultimate victory. But a single bomb capable of erasing an entire city suggested something far more disturbing than mere numerical superiority. It indicated that American industrial and scientific capabilities had achieved a level that rendered traditional military calculations obsolete. It meant that while fighting a global war on 2 fronts, America had simultaneously developed weapons that belonged more to science fiction than military reality. It suggested that everything Japanese military leadership understood about modern warfare had become instantly antiquated. Intelligence Colonel Hideaki Sato presented his analysis at 4 o'clock that afternoon. His team had been meticulously tracking American production capacity since 1941, and their calculations had proven consistently, terrifyingly accurate. The Americans had manufactured 88,410 tanks during the conflict. Japan had produced 6,450. The Americans had constructed 41 aircraft carriers. Japan had built 15. American shipyards had launched cargo vessels at a rate that defied comprehension, actually outpacing the rate at which enemy submarines could destroy them. But Sato's newest calculations suggested something that fundamentally shattered their entire conceptual framework. Speaking barely above a whisper, he delivered his conclusion: if the Americans can eliminate entire cities with individual weapons, then they possess scientific capabilities that make numerical comparisons meaningless. They are not prosecuting the same category of warfare that we are fighting. We are soldiers with swords, and they have become something else entirely. Foreign Minister Togo articulated what everyone present understood but feared to voice: and if they possess one such weapon, we must assume they possess additional ones, perhaps many more. The Japanese perception of American capabilities had been shaped by a series of carefully constructed beliefs that predated the attack on Pearl Harbor by years. These assumptions, meticulously documented in countless strategic assessments and planning sessions, would crumble entirely within days of that first atomic detonation. But to truly understand what the High Command finally grasped, one must first examine what they had convinced themselves to believe despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. In November 1941, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had provided perhaps the most accurate assessment of American industrial capacity that any Japanese leader would offer throughout the entire conflict. His warning, preserved in naval staff records, was remarkably explicit: I can run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but I have absolutely no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year of any protracted conflict. Yamamoto had lived in America during his younger years. He had studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had personally toured American factories and witnessed the nation's industrial infrastructure with his own eyes. His calculations weren't based on wishful thinking or nationalist fervor, but on cold mathematical reality. American steel production alone exceeded Japan's entire industrial output across all sectors. American petroleum reserves were practically infinite compared to Japan's precarious dependence on imported fuel. Yet Yamamoto's warnings were systematically dismissed by the very officers now sitting in that underground bunker contemplating the implications of atomic warfare. The Army's strategic planning documents from 1941, later recovered from military archives, revealed the alternative narrative that leadership had chosen to embrace. American industrial might would be neutralized by 3 critical factors. First, the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean would work in Japan's favor. The conquered territories would create a defensive perimeter so extensive that American supply lines would collapse under their own weight. Every ship, aircraft, and bullet would need to travel 5,000 miles across hostile waters before reaching combat zones. Japanese forces could sustain themselves from nearby conquered territories while America exhausted itself maintaining impossible logistics chains. Second, American society's fundamental weakness, its softness, individualism, and aversion to sacrifice, would become Japan's greatest advantage. Military planners calculated that after sustaining 30,000 to 40,000 combat deaths, American public opinion would demand negotiated peace. The Japanese soldiers' willingness to die for the emperor would outlast America's willingness to continue fighting. Third, tactical superiority through training, spiritual strength, and innovative battlefield techniques would create casualty ratios that negated American numerical advantages. One Japanese soldier would prove equivalent to 3 or 4 American soldiers in actual combat effectiveness. These assumptions had been tested and found catastrophically wanting in every major engagement of the Pacific War. Yet Japanese high command had consistently reinterpreted defeats as validation of theories requiring minor adjustments rather than fundamental revision. At Midway in June 1942, Japan lost 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers in a single day. The official assessment blamed bad luck and tactical errors, not American code-breaking capabilities or the fundamental vulnerability of Japan's carrier-dependent strategy. The underlying assumption that Japanese forces could overcome numerical disadvantages through superior spirit remained unquestioned. During the Guadalcanal campaign from August 1942 to February 1943, Japanese forces discovered that Americans could indeed sustain logistics across vast oceanic distances and could match Japanese soldiers in brutal jungle warfare. The official assessment blamed local commanders for insufficient fighting spirit, not the strategic impossibility of the situation. The assumption that American society would crack under sustained casualties remained intact despite mounting evidence to the contrary. By August 1945, every major assumption had been systematically demolished by battlefield reality. Yet senior leadership had never formally acknowledged these failures. General Annemie's continued advocacy for fighting to the last citizen represented not stupidity or madness, but the logical endpoint of beliefs that had never been properly questioned or revised despite overwhelming contradictory evidence. The afternoon of August 6 marked the first time in the entire war that Japan's Supreme War Council confronted their illusions with unvarnished honesty. Intelligence Colonel Sato presented what he termed the reality assessment, a document his team had compiled over the previous 6 months but had been prevented from presenting until the atomic bomb made denial impossible. The statistics were beyond devastating. American aircraft production in 1944 alone exceeded Japan's total production for the entire war. American shipyards were constructing escort carriers faster than Japan could train pilots to fly from them. American ammunition factories produced more shells in a single week than Japanese factories managed in an entire month. But Sato's most damning statistics concerned scientific research and development. His intelligence network had documented American research facilities employing over 130,000 scientists and engineers working exclusively on military technology. Japan's comparable effort employed approximately 6,000 individuals. American research universities, Harvard, MIT, Berkeley, Chicago, each possessed physics departments larger than Japan's entire scientific community combined. The atomic bomb, Sato explained with devastating clarity, required facilities that we could not have constructed even if we had possessed the theoretical knowledge. The Americans built entire cities in complete secrecy. Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Hanford, Washington. Los Alamos, New Mexico. These facilities consumed more electricity than our major cities. They employed 130,000 workers. The project cost $2 billion, more than Japan spent on its entire war effort in 1944. Foreign Minister Togo asked the question that would echo through subsequent war crimes trials and historical analyses for decades: how could we not have known? Sato's answer was uncomfortable in its accuracy. We knew, Foreign Minister. Our intelligence services reported on American industrial expansion continuously. We intercepted communications about large-scale secret projects. We documented their scientific recruitment efforts. But every report was dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. We chose not to know because knowing would have required acknowledging that victory was impossible from the very beginning. Admiral Toyota added his own bitter assessment. The Americans fought this war with one hand tied behind their back. They fought Germany and Japan simultaneously while developing weapons we cannot even comprehend. They produced more war material than we thought physically possible while maintaining their civilian economy at levels that exceeded our peacetime production. They are not merely stronger than us. They are operating on an entirely different level of civilization. This admission, that America represented not just greater strength but a fundamentally different category of capability, marked the crucial shift in understanding. For 4 years, Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as materialistic and weak, dependent on machines because they lacked spiritual strength. The atomic bomb revealed this narrative as catastrophically, perhaps fatally wrong. The psychological impact extended far beyond simple military calculation. Cabinet Secretary Hitsun Sakomizu recorded in his diary that evening, "We have been fighting an enemy we never understood. We assumed they thought as we thought, that their society functioned as ours functioned, that their limits matched our limits. The atomic bomb proves we were fighting blind, striking at shadows while the real enemy operated in dimensions we couldn't even perceive." August 7th began with reconnaissance reports that made the destruction seem even more incomprehensible. Aircraft that finally penetrated the radiation-contaminated zone transmitted photographs that circulated among high command within hours. Major Jitsun Kitamura, who piloted the first successful reconnaissance mission, reported atmospheric conditions unlike anything in his experience. Updrafts of such violence they threw his aircraft 2,000 feet higher in seconds. Air temperatures that exceeded his instruments' measuring capacity. Visibility obscured by smoke that rose in a column reaching the stratosphere itself. The photographs, developed by 11 o'clock that morning, showed something military analysts initially refused to accept as possible. The city center, approximately 4 square miles, had been completely erased. Not destroyed in the conventional sense where rubble and foundations remained, but flattened to bare earth as if the hand of a god had simply wiped the city from existence. Structures hadn't collapsed or burned, they had been vaporized. The reconnaissance team estimated that everything within a 1-mile radius of the blast center had ceased to exist in any recognizable form. Intelligence analysts compared these images to conventional bombing results. The most devastating conventional raid of the war, the Tokyo firebombing of March 9 to 10, 1945, had required 334 B-29 bombers dropping 1,665 tons of incendiaries over 3 hours. The atomic destruction exceeded that raid's devastation, accomplished by a single bomb from a single aircraft in a single instant. The Supreme War Council reconvened at 2 o'clock on August 7 with intelligence that fundamentally altered the strategic landscape. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had summoned Japanese Ambassador Naotake Sato to the Kremlin at midnight Moscow time. The message was brief and devastating. The Soviet Union would consider itself at war with Japan effective August 9, 1945. This announcement shattered Japan's final strategic hope. 4 months, Japanese diplomacy had worked desperately to secure Soviet mediation for negotiated peace terms. The fantasy was that Stalin, never fully trusted by his Western allies, might broker an arrangement that preserved some Japanese territory and prevented complete occupation. Soviet entry into the war eliminated this possibility entirely. General Annemie's face, according to multiple witnesses, drained of all color as the implications registered. Japan now faced enemies on every front with no prospect of negotiated settlement. American atomic weapons from the east, Soviet armies from the north, British Commonwealth forces from the south, and continued Chinese resistance in occupied territories. The empire that had once stretched from the borders of India to the mid-Pacific was being compressed back toward the home islands with overwhelming force. Foreign Minister Togo presented the stark reality with brutal clarity: "We have 3 choices. Surrender unconditionally, fight until every city is destroyed by atomic weapons, or fight until Soviet and American forces invade and Japan ceases to exist as a nation. There are no other options. We must choose our destruction." August 8 brought fragmentary intelligence about Soviet movements that confirmed their worst fears. The Red Army had launched a massive assault into Manchuria with overwhelming force. The Guangdong Army, once considered the elite formation of Japanese military power, was being systematically annihilated. Soviet tank columns advanced 50 miles in the first day alone, encountering resistance that crumbled before forces that had learned their trade destroying Nazi Germany. The Manchurian operation demonstrated another uncomfortable truth about American power. The Soviets were equipped with thousands of American vehicles, trucks, and communications equipment provided through Lend-Lease. American industrial capacity had not only sustained its own forces across 2 oceans but had simultaneously equipped its allies on a scale that seemed impossible by Japanese standards. A single American program, Lend-Lease, had provided more material to Soviet forces than Japan's entire industrial output for the war. At 11:02 hours on August 9, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. The communication from Nagasaki Regional Command was even briefer than the first. Second atomic attack confirmed. City eliminated. Casualties beyond counting. Then silence. The Supreme War Council's emergency session that afternoon descended into something unprecedented in Japanese military protocol. Open acknowledgement of complete strategic failure. Navy Minister Admiral Yamamoto Yonai spoke with remarkable candor for a military officer in that environment. The Americans have demonstrated that they can destroy our cities at will, one by one until nothing remains. They have shown the capability to continue this indefinitely. We cannot defend against weapons we cannot detect until they detonate. Our anti-aircraft systems are meaningless. Our fighter aircraft cannot intercept what they cannot find. Our civil defense preparations are worthless against this power. Army Chief of Staff General Yamamoto added his own assessment, one that would have been considered defeatist heresy mere weeks earlier. The atomic bomb changes every fundamental military calculation. Concentrated forces become targets for instant annihilation. Cities become graveyards waiting to happen. Our strategy of fighting to the last citizen assumes Americans must invade to occupy. But if they can simply eliminate cities without invasion, our entire defensive doctrine becomes meaningless. They can erase Japan from existence without ever setting foot on our soil. Intelligence estimates presented that evening calculated that America likely possessed between 3 and 7 additional atomic bombs with production capacity for more. Even if this estimate was optimistic, even if America possessed only one more weapon, the strategic implication remained identical. Continued resistance was national suicide. Cabinet Secretary Sakomizu recorded the Emperor's private comments from an audience that evening. His Majesty expressed that the unendurable must be endured. The atomic bombs have demonstrated that continued resistance will result in the complete annihilation of the Japanese people. We must accept terms that preserve the nation's existence, even if those terms are painful beyond measure. The phrase, "the unendurable must be endured," would become the foundation for Japan's surrender announcement. But the path from this private imperial acknowledgement to actual surrender would require navigating military opposition that remained fierce despite overwhelming evidence of futility. August 10 brought the formal Japanese surrender offer, transmitted through Swiss diplomatic channels. The message was conditional. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration's terms provided the Emperor's sovereignty was maintained. The American response, delivered August 12, was deliberately ambiguous. The Emperor would be subject to the supreme commander of Allied powers, but his ultimate status would be determined by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. This ambiguity created the final crisis. Military hardliners led by General Anami interpreted this as unacceptable. They argued for continued resistance despite atomic weapons. Their position was no longer based on any prospect of victory but on preserving national honor through glorious destruction rather than accepting occupation and foreign judgment. The surrender formalities extended through late August and early September 1945, but the psychological transformation of Japanese high command was complete by August 16. What followed was not merely military defeat but a comprehensive re-evaluation of everything Japanese leadership had believed about modern warfare, industrial capacity, and their own place in the global order. The formal surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, brought Japanese representatives face to face with the physical manifestation of American power they had consistently underestimated. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, who signed the surrender document, recorded his impressions in his personal diary. The harbor was filled with American warships as far as one could see. Hundreds upon hundreds of vessels. Aircraft filled the sky in formations that blocked out the sun itself. The Americans displayed their power not through threats or boasting but through simple presence. This armada represented merely a fraction of their total military force, yet it exceeded everything Japan possessed at the peak of our strength. General Yoshijiro Yumizu, representing the Imperial General Staff, noted that the ceremony's location was itself a profound lesson in American capability. We surrendered aboard a battleship built in American shipyards in less time than it took us to plan a single naval operation. The Missouri was one of dozens of capital ships they constructed while simultaneously fighting across 2 oceans and developing atomic weapons. We prepared for war for a decade. They prepared for 15 months and destroyed us utterly. The American occupation forces began arriving in late August, and Japanese military observers documented details that reinforced their new understanding. The equipment, organization, and logistics demonstrated capabilities that previous intelligence reports had accurately described but High Command had refused to credit. A single American infantry division moved with more trucks than the entire Imperial Army possessed. American supply operations delivered fresh food, including ice cream, to frontline troops while Japanese forces had been starving on grass and bark. American medical facilities routinely treated injuries that Japanese military medicine considered certainly fatal. Intelligence Colonel Sato compiled his final report in September 1945, titled, Why We Lost, an assessment of strategic miscalculation. The document, now preserved in Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies, provided brutal honesty about the conflict's true nature. We lost the war in December 1941 when we attacked an enemy we did not understand and refused to understand. Every battle thereafter was simply the working out of inevitable mathematics. American industrial capacity exceeded ours by factors of 10 to 20 in every measurable category. Their scientific establishment was larger than our entire educated population. Their resource base was effectively unlimited, while ours depended on conquests we could never sustain. We fought believing spirit could overcome material disadvantage. We were catastrophically wrong. The American Occupation Administration, led by General Douglas MacArthur, provided Japanese officials with access to information about American war production that confirmed their worst realizations. The United States had produced 88,410 tanks, 257,000 artillery pieces, 2,434,000 trucks, 17 million rifles, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. More staggering still, they had accomplished this while maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded Japanese peacetime prosperity. Former Prime Minister Suzuki, in conversations recorded by American occupation historians, articulated what Japanese leadership had finally grasped. We thought we were fighting a nation of merchants who valued profit over honor, comfort over sacrifice. We were catastrophically wrong. We were fighting the most productive civilization in human history, one that could simultaneously sustain a mass consumer economy and total war production. They didn't choose between butter and guns. They produced both in quantities we found incomprehensible. The Manhattan Project's details, gradually revealed to Japanese scientists through occupation channels, provided the most humbling lesson of all. The project had employed 130,000 people and cost $2 billion, more than Japan's entire 1944 military budget. It required constructing facilities that consumed more electricity than major cities. It involved theoretical physics at levels Japanese scientists hadn't imagined possible. The atomic bomb wasn't merely a weapon but evidence of scientific and industrial capacity that placed America in a fundamentally different category of civilization. Admiral Toyoda's final assessment, written in 1946 for occupation historians, captured the complete reversal of Japanese military thinking. We began the war believing American democracy made them weak, their diversity made them disunited, their wealth made them soft. We ended the war understanding that democracy enabled innovation, diversity provided talent, and wealth funded capabilities we couldn't match. Every assumption we held was not merely wrong but precisely backwards. The psychological impact on military leadership manifested in various ways. Some, like General Anami, chose death rather than living with the reality of how catastrophically they had miscalculated. Others, like Admiral Yamamoto, became advocates for complete demilitarization, arguing that Japan's militaristic culture had led to systematic strategic blindness. Most simply struggled to reconcile the warriors they believed themselves to be with the reality that they had led their nation into an unwinnable war through willful self-deception. Japanese historians working under occupation supervision began documenting how thoroughly intelligence reports had been ignored or suppressed. Accurate assessments of American production had been dismissed as defeatism. Warnings about American scientific capabilities had been suppressed as harmful to morale. Evidence that Japan was losing the war had been reinterpreted as temporary setbacks requiring only more fighting spirit. The entire command structure had created an information environment where truth became treason and optimism became policy regardless of reality. The final lesson Japanese high command absorbed was perhaps the most bitter of all. American power had not been fully deployed during the conflict. The United States had fought a two-ocean war while maintaining substantial forces in reserve, developing next-generation weapons, and preparing for potential conflicts that might follow. The atomic bombs represented not America's maximum effort but what they could accomplish while simultaneously pursuing a dozen other major initiatives. Japanese forces had fought with total commitment of every available resource, pushing their nation to complete exhaustion. American forces had fought with comfortable margins everywhere, never approaching their theoretical maximum capability. The disparity was not just in quantity but in the fundamental nature of the civilizations involved. By 1947, when American occupation officials conducted comprehensive interviews with former Japanese military leadership, The transformation in thinking was complete. General Yumizu's testimony to occupation historians summarized what Japanese high command had finally understood. We lost because we never understood our enemy. We attributed to them our own weaknesses, limited resources, narrow industrial base, inflexible thinking, when they possessed the opposite. We believed our own propaganda when we should have believed our intelligence services. The atomic bomb was not the cause of our defeat. It was merely the final proof that we had been defeated from the moment we started fighting an enemy we never truly comprehended. The interviews revealed a leadership coming to terms with the magnitude of their miscalculation. They had not simply lost a war, they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern industrial civilization and their place within it. The atomic bombs had forced them to confront the reality that courage could not defeat chemistry, spirit could not overcome steel, and determination meant nothing when facing an enemy who possessed both determination and 10 times the capacity to give it physical form. Former Navy Minister Yanai reflected on the strategic blindness that had led to catastrophe. We convinced ourselves that American materialism was weakness, when in fact their ability to produce materials was their greatest strength. We saw their concern for individual life as cowardice, when it actually drove them to develop technologies that could win wars with minimal casualties. We interpreted their reluctance to fight as inability to fight, when they were simply choosing their moment. The occupation period revealed additional dimensions of American capability that deepened Japanese understanding of their defeat. American engineers rebuilt destroyed infrastructure faster than Japanese planners thought possible. American agricultural advisors introduced farming techniques that increased yields beyond what Japanese agriculture had ever achieved. American medical teams eliminated diseases that had plagued Japan for centuries. The defeat was not merely military but represented a comprehensive superiority in virtually every aspect of modern civilization. Intelligence assessments compiled during the occupation painted a picture of systematic self-deception at the highest levels of Japanese leadership. Report after report had accurately described American capabilities, only to be filed away as requiring further verification, or dismissed as psychological warfare. The military leadership had created an echo chamber where only information confirming their preconceptions was accepted as valid. Colonel Sato's final contribution to the historical record was a detailed analysis of how Japanese intelligence had actually functioned quite effectively. The failure was not in gathering information but in leadership's willingness to accept it. His team had accurately reported American production figures, correctly assessed scientific capabilities, and even identified the existence of massive secret projects. The breakdown occurred when this information reached senior commanders who refused to believe what contradicted their fundamental assumptions about racial and spiritual superiority. The atomic bombs had shattered these assumptions in a way that no conventional defeat could have achieved. They represented not just superior firepower but a different order of civilization entirely. A nation that could split the atom while simultaneously fighting a global war operated by different rules than those Japanese leadership had imagined governed human conflict. By 1948, when the occupation began transitioning toward Japanese self-governance, former military leaders had undergone a complete philosophical transformation. Admiral Toyota wrote in his memoirs, "We learned too late that the 20th century belonged to nations that could harness science and industry, not those that relied on spirit and tradition. The Americans understood this. We refused to understand it until atomic fire taught us the price of our ignorance." The legacy of this realization would shape Japanese society for generations. The complete abandonment of militarism, the embrace of technology and industry, and the recognition that national power came from economic rather than military strength all stemmed from the shattering revelations of August 1945. The atomic bombs had done more than end a war. They had forced an entire civilization to confront the reality that their understanding of power, progress, and their place in the world had been catastrophically wrong. General Yumizu's final recorded statement before his death captured the transformation. "We thought we were samurai facing merchants. We discovered we were men with swords facing the sun itself. The atomic bomb did not defeat us. It simply revealed that we had already been defeated by our refusal to see the world as it truly was. Our greatest enemy was not America but our own blindness to reality." The Japanese High Command's journey from absolute certainty to complete comprehension represents one of military history's most dramatic reversals of understanding. They began the war convinced that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage, that quality could defeat quantity, and that will could triumph over industrial capacity. They ended it understanding that modern warfare had become a contest of scientific and industrial capability where traditional military virtues, while important, were ultimately secondary to technological and productive superiority. The atomic bombs were not merely weapons but messengers, delivering in unmistakable terms the news that Japan had been fighting the wrong war against the wrong enemy with the wrong assumptions from the very beginning. The message they carried was simple and devastating. The age of the warrior had ended, replaced by the age of the scientist and engineer. Japan had prepared for the last war while America had been creating the next one. And in that fundamental miscalculation lay the seeds of the most complete defeat in modern military history.